Author Gerard McClendon. He's the pastor of New Life Covenant Church, and this year was named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. Pastor Wilfredo de Jesus, and he's one of the most prominent anti-racism activists and authors in the country. His new book, Culture of Cruelty, hit stores in February. Tim Wise, please welcome all of them to our show.
Good morning.
Good morning.
A good topic today. We're ready?
We're ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
And G, first off, why don't you explain the differences on what we're going to be discussing here today?
Well, you know, even before, this is a difficult topic to discuss. It's emotional. There's a wide range of differing views. But even before we can even talk about it, it's what do we mean by race? And what do we mean by racism? And it's actually a term that's been changing culturally, significantly, depending upon the time and how people use the word. But, you know, there's racism, which is based on race. There's you know, there's ethnicity, which is based on cultures within races, and there's also discrimination based on nationality and also religious, belief and orientation as well. So it's very interesting because it's changed over time, and it's always been an institutionalized area because it's always been something that's determined by the government, particularly in the United States. The Office of Budget Management, they determine it. The Census Bureau also determines it. Back in 1977, they only had 4 races, one of which people wouldn't even think of as a race, which is American Indian and Alaskan Native. They didn't even consider Latinos and Hispanics a race. They considered it ethnicity only. So it's changed over time. And then, of course, now in the post 9/11 era, people use racism often in terms of
racial profiling.
Exactly, and discrimination against religious people with Arabics who are Muslim. So it's very interesting. It's changed and it's developed, and I think we have to kind of be cognizant of that as we discuss this issue.
And I think just to give you a little background on why we chose to do this show, for us, it really, Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman case, we talked a lot. We spent a week or so covering, of course, that horrific event, but it made us think about this is a conversation that it's hard to have, but we have to have it. So that was kind of the impetus for us deciding to dedicate 2 whole shows to the topic of race, because as you saw with that case, same case, the facts all laid out, but depending on who you talk to, they saw the case totally different. Black folks saw it, most black folks, I will say, saw it one way. Other people did not see it that way. And so I'm curious, I mean, obviously, you know, that just happened recently, but I'd like to hear what our panel has to say in terms of, and Tim, why don't we start with you, because you wrote numerous books on racism. How did you look at that case in terms of race relations? Because there were so many people that said this is not about race. Other people said, oh yeah, it is.
Well, it's absurd to think it wasn't. I mean, even George Zimmerman's defense attorney admitted that the only reason that his client viewed Trayvon as a threat that night was because of prior break-ins by other young black men, not one of whom was Trayvon Martin, not one of whom knew Trayvon Martin, not one of whom even looked like Trayvon Martin except for the color of his skin. So the initial suspicion that set the entire event in motion was first and foremost about race, regardless of what one thinks about the evidence of self-defense. Were it not for George Zimmerman's racialized suspicion of Trayvon Martin would still be alive, George Zimmerman would still be a pathetic wannabe cop, and nobody would know his name. And so I think that's the fundamental thing. And I think what really this speaks to is the way that white Americans, by and large, with some exceptions noted, and black and brown folk in this country, people of color, view just about every event that happens that touches on race differently. And it's not new. It has always been that way. Even in the early 60s, white Americans, according to Gallup polls, did not think that people of color faced significant discrimination. So even when it was blatant, white Americans were missing it.
Right. Do you think, though, that we all naturally racially profile? Do you think that that's not necessarily you're racist because of that, but when you're walking down the street at night and you're looking at somebody walking towards you, you're automatically, you know, your defense mechanism is up, and you're debating whether or not this person is a threat?
I don't think it's natural. I think it's conditioned, because, for instance, we know that white folks in this country are about 5 times more likely to be violently victimized by another white person than by a black person. So we ought to be afraid of white people. Every time we see a white person walking down the street toward us, we, oh my God, white people moved into my neighborhood, I gotta go. You know, it's frightening. But we don't do that because we've been conditioned to fear people of color. So I think for white folks to engage in profiling is actually statistically illiterate. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Interesting.
You know, it's a very interesting thing that you mentioned as it pertains to fear, because if I'm a black person, I'm afraid of Julianne Hough and I'm afraid of Richie Incognito. See, we're in a situation where we have to realize that the elephant in the room is racism and slavery, and textbooks still do not deal with it adequately in our K-12 school system. The #1 cash crop was picked by captured Africans in the United States. That story has still not been told, and until it's told, until black people are revered as high as any other human being in this country, you're never going to get rid of racism. This country was built on black people for 400 years. That story is still not in textbooks.
But what do you say to those white people, though? What do you say to those white people who say, oh, no, we've come such a long way. Oh, no, it's not nearly as bad. Go ahead.
This is where we go, and thank God we've got Tim Wise, a white man who is representing all people. See, at Chicago State University, we do perception and expectation studies of teachers and principals. We do these studies based on an instrument called the African American English Teacher Attitude Scale. Principals and teachers, K-12, still have negative attitudes towards black students, regardless of whether they know the student or not. That is a problem when our K-12 school systems have principals and teachers saying, you're black, therefore you're not educable and you're not college bound.
But racism, though, has changed quite a bit. It is not as blatant as it used to be. It's more about opportunity now, don't you think? I mean, it's the underlying measures that are there. As before, you know, your parents and your parents dealt with a different racism than we deal with.
Well,
not that it's better, it's different.
Jim Crow once existed, but Jim Crow is still a metaphor today. You know, we still see it. I hold a PhD from Loyola University. I was in a conversation with people that weren't my color that said, McClendon, where did you buy your degree? And when I told them where my degree was from, they were like, how did you get through that school? So where is that coming from if you don't even know me? You're not respecting me as an intellectual. Where does that come from?
I guess, you know, going back to the to Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, the question is where is the discussion on racism and race in this country when so many people saw that trial in such a different way?
I think people are afraid of that discussion, and I think that's why it's so important for us to have it here, but go ahead.
But, you know, it's interesting because anytime we would talk about it, as I monitor social media, there were many people that would write in that would say, hey, look, racism doesn't exist anymore. A lot of people cited the fact that we had a black president in office as you know, evidence that racism doesn't exist anymore. But it's very interesting that America is still at this divide.
But that's the kind of denial that white Americans have specialized in for hundreds of years. I mean, Pakistan elected a woman head of state, Benazir Bhutto, in 1988. I don't think anyone would have said that patriarchy had been eliminated in Karachi. I don't think that they would have said sexism was dead in Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, Ireland. They've all had women as the head of state. But somehow in this country, we think a man of color becomes president and the problem is completely solved. Notice very few people of color assume that, but a lot of white folks do because we would rather just not have the conversation.
And Wilfredo, how do you address the issue of racism in your church?
Well, I want to go back to the Trayvon. I think what happened there is a tragedy, no doubt about it. Would I call it racism? I would have a different set of lenses with that. Would it probably line it up with racial profiling? For history, black and brown has always worked together to be able to address this issue. Even from the time of Dr. King and Cesar Chavez, there was always this partnership. And what we're trying to see, I guess, in our society is people trying to divide the black and brown power that exists. Although we as in the religious sector believe that this was a tragedy, the bigger problem that we have is this issue of racism that stems more than hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago. My opinion of this is more than just race. We have a heart problem with this issue. Whether it be white, black, Hispanic, yellow, brown, it don't make a difference. Until you deal with the heart of man, regardless of their color, you will continue to have the problem we have in our society.
There are theories that in 50 years there will be no race because of all of the marriages, all of the blending that we have had. Do you think that is possible, and do you think that's going to? Well, you're just shaking your head.
No, I mean there's no race now. I mean the reality is scientists will tell you race doesn't exist. So in other words, there's
Why
no.
do you say that?
Well, because the genetic differences between those of us called white and those of us called black and those of us called Latino and Asian, etc., are so minuscule that they really don't amount to anything scientifically important. So race is already largely a fiction, but racism is real. And so even if we get to that day when, let's say, they estimate whites will be half the population by 2043, people of color the other half, the idea that that's going to mean we're not going to have racism. Look, South African whites were only 6% of that nation's population, and they held on to power for a very long time, even though they were statistically very much underrepresented. So we got to deal with racism. We can't just assume that mixing and blending is going to make it go away. We've got to do the work.
Right.
We've got to do the work.
Right.
50 years, using that 50 years, by the year 2030, Hispanics would be 133 million in this country. Let's deal with that issue, right? We elected a black president with the hope that we would address this issue of undocumented, right? 71% of Latinos came out to vote for a black president who we thought, because of this relationship of black and brown, but the reality is that you have a black president that's in a system that is toxic. I mean, whether it be the House of Representatives, whether it be the senators, even though if the black president's trying to fight for justice,
Sure.
he's still part of a system that is just messed up all the way up
Well,
and down.
and then two, I mean, I do believe, and I've said it on this show before, I think still the fact that we have a black president, some in Congress are still not going to respect the fact that a black man is in that position of power. I mean, and we'd be naive and we'd be just silly to not think that that has been part of the problem why he has been fought on every single thing. And I'm sure some people will disagree with me, but this is my opinion, and I feel because he is a black, that is why he has had the opposition that he's
when
had.
people show up to rallies like they did during the healthcare debate,
Thank you.
with photos of him dressed like an African witch doctor with a bone through his nose, it's sort of hard to deny that that's about race.
But you have
it's sort of
people
hard to
that
say, no,
will.
I just want a tax cut. Well, why do you have the African witch doctor picture? What does it have to do with your taxes? So it's very clear when you look at the rhetoric how racialized it actually had become by the time of the healthcare debate. You had Glenn Beck saying that the healthcare bill was really not about healthcare. It was about getting reparations for black people. Now, what kind of reparations? Like, what kind of reparations is it that you have to get sick to get paid? What kind of scam is that? That doesn't even make any sense. But that was the argument that was being made, and the reason he made it was he was very astute politically. What he was saying to white people was, they're coming for your money, and when they get it, they're going to give it to those people. Don't you see? Don't you see? It's a way to gin up that white anxiety and resentment. That's maybe even a bigger issue than overt racism. It's
what
that
do white
anxiety.
people have to be anxious and have anxiety about?
Well, I think when you have been led to believe that the country is yours, when you have been led to believe that you are the prototype of an American, and you've been told that for hundreds of years, it makes sense that when you start to have to share that designation with people who look different, pray different, eat different food, have different cultural traditions, all of a sudden it's like, think about if you're in a private club and then all of a sudden it opens up. It's like not as special anymore.
Right.
Oh my goodness, you mean, I lived in New Orleans for 10 years, and during the time I was there was a big debate about the Mardi Gras clubs, whether they should be able to remain segregated. And when the city said, and I think rightly so, you can't be segregated anymore and get police and fire protection, there were these rich white folks that were like, well, we'll just stop parading. We'll just stop our 150-year-old tradition if we can't exclude these people. It's like saying, if I can't keep you out, I'm not special anymore. And that's a sickness.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Very much the white flight, too.
Yes.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
And racism is more, we're talking black and white, but we also, after 9/11, think about Middle Eastern Americans in our country and how they were treated. And I got to be honest, I remember getting on a plane after 9/11, and you're sitting next to a guy who's wearing a turban, and naturally you were thinking about 9/11.
Which is weird, though, right? Because the guys that hijacked those planes were wearing Izods and penny loafers, dressed like computer programmers. So it doesn't even make any sense.
Right.
But think about the LAX shooting. If that had been done, last week, by someone who was brown-skinned and Muslim, it would be 24/7 on the news. They would not stop talking about it. But because it was a white guy who said he was a patriot and he was angry at the government, it's like, oh, next story, please. Let's move on.
Yeah, well, it's the demonization of the situation. When you look at blacks, it's hard to come up with positive stereotypes. Whereas when you look at other groups, it's easy. That's a major problem in a so-called free society.
Right. Well, we're going to put a pin in it. We're going to be right back with more on this special show, Facing Race, the Color Divide. It is real. It is here. We got to talk about it. Stay tuned.
Everyone's a little bit racist sometimes. Doesn't mean we go around committing hate crimes. Look around and you will find no one's really colorblind. Maybe it's a fact we all should face. Everyone makes judgments based on race. Now, not
And that was a clip from a performance of Avenue Q on The View many years ago, but it raises a good question. Are we all a little bit racist and not know it? What do you think, Wilfredo?
Well, I think we are. I think the fact that we're human beings, we are. And now, we talked about it earlier, it comes in different masks, if you will, right? Because if you don't have power, does it mean that you're not racist? You've got brown on brown killing on that. Does that make that racist? Well, I think in some form it does, because racism ultimately leads into hatred and anger, and that's what we're seeing in violence.
Including self-hatred.
Yeah, self-hatred.
Right.
So there is that, because the fact that we're human beings, it's called survival. I want to be able to get on top of you. Even if I am Hispanic, I'm Hispanic. We're seeing that in the streets of Chicago. We're seeing that across this nation. And universal. Racism is universal. So I believe that we all have a little bit of that in different forms of it.
You know, I think that there's personal, communal, and institutional racism as well.
Yeah.
So, for instance, on a personal level, if I give my white students lower grades for doing equal work to my black students, as a black professor, I'm being racist because I have the power to blend prejudice with my racism.
Yeah.
That becomes racism. Whereas that's a personal level. On a communal level, I can do the same because I have the power. But on an institutional level, I may not have that power, which I may have the prejudice. I may say, well, I don't like white people, I don't like Hispanic. But if I don't have the power to manipulate them, then there's no racism.
Right. Well, it's like, you know, I'm sure there are police officers of color who might not like white people, but they're not pulling white folks over in trucks and profiling them and searching their truck, because they know they don't have the power to get away with that. They may be biased. They may be actually quite bigoted, but there's very little they can do with that. And so that means there's a qualitative difference between these types of racism, even if they're all existing.
Well, I think it separates the difference, and Gerard just touched on it, between being a racist and being prejudiced.
Right.
So that's why I've always understood it as a minority. It is almost impossible for me to be racist over the white, because I have no power. Now, like you said, on a personal level, maybe, but that's the difference between being a racist and being prejudiced. I may be prejudiced against white people, which I'm not. I love y'all white people too. But that's the difference.
On a personal level, that's you just being a jerk if you don't like somebody because of the way they look. But because of the cultural and societal institutions that basically back you up on that belief, that's what creates racism.
Sure, you got a comment from, so I want to hear from people at home.
Well, you know, there's a lot of people writing in. Cheryl T says there's plenty of racism against whites, and I think this is what we're talking about. Why is it always just about the blacks?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I'm sure that there.
Good. I'm glad you white in here can answer this question for us, because I can't answer that.
I've been white for a long time. I've been white for 45 years, you know? And in that period of time, I would be lying if I didn't say I had been mistreated by people who were people of color, just like I've been mistreated by people who were white. But the difference is this. Look, when you look, if we're talking about racism as a social problem, we got to look at it as a social problem. Is there an equivalence here? And there isn't. So, for instance, the Labor Department data says you got black folks with a college degree, almost twice as likely as whites with a degree to be out of work. Latinos with a degree, 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans with a degree, a third more likely to be out of work than comparable whites. So if racism were really coming from all sides in equal proportion, you wouldn't see the disparities continuing to benefit one at the expense of the other. So it's not that that woman is wrong. It's not that she's wrong, that there may be bias, and she may have been mistreated mistreated by a store clerk or by somebody, and if that happened, that's ethically just as bad as any other form of racism. But it is not creating the social dislocation. It's like if you look at FBI data every year, y'all might not believe this, but every year there's like 10 cases of straight bashing, meaning gay folks that go and just beat up straight folks. It happens like 10 times a year. Well, the reverse happens thousands of times a year. LGBT folks getting beaten and killed. And if I were to say, well, now straight bashing is just as big a problem as gay bashing, we need to deal with heterophobia, I think most people would think, nah, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It may be wrong for an individual gay or lesbian person to go beat up somebody who's straight, obviously, but I'm not going to make that an equivalent social crisis, right?
When you look at it institutionally, I'm glad Tim brought that up, because when you start to internalize your racism, then it becomes a serious problem. If you look at Dr. Claude Steele and the stereotype threat studies, where if I believe, if I'm asked to write that I'm black on a test, before I take the test, I will do worse than if I didn't have to check that I was black. It's the same with females who take mathematics and science tests. If a female takes a math or a science test and they don't have to check that they're female, they'll do better than if they have to check female first. The stereotype threat is that I'm not looked upon as a smart person in math or science because I'm a female. That's when you internalize what society thinks about you on an institutional and a very molecular level.
All right, this is some good stuff. Coming up next, we're going to talk about the issue of discrimination within the races and a whole bunch more. Stick around.
Now, we got a lot of things, a lot of racism going on in the world right now. Who's more racist, black people or white people? Black people. You know why? Because we hate black people too. Everything white people don't like about black people really don't like about black people.
It is funny. I mean, come on. Well, that was a scene from Chris Rock's stand-up special, Bring the Pain. So we're talking about race today, and one great point Chris brings up is discrimination within the races. And as I was just kind of talking about in the commercial break, for black folks, there's so many different skin shades of us. Sometimes you do see the darker black folks discriminated against the light ones and vice versa.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I think because they feel like the lighter the skin, the closer you are to being white, and the more advantages you have versus being a dark-skinned African-American.
And it's probably very similar to what, Gerard, you were saying earlier about it being an internal struggle that you don't even realize that is happening.
And because maybe go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
You look at after the Civil War ended, and you look at the late 1800s, early 1900s, where blacks were moving from the South to the North getting industrial jobs. There were still nightclubs based on the paper bag test. If you were lighter than a paper bag, you could get into a black nightclub. If you were darker than the paper bag, oh no, we don't want you. We know you black. We know you're a brother or a sister, but you can't come up in here because we need you to be a little bit higher yellow.
Let me tell you a story real quick, a personal story. So my mother's grandmother, her name was Leon Bradshaw. When they moved here to Chicago back in the day, she wanted to buy a house. And she was very fair, almost white, and she married a man who's very dark, very black, right? So he goes in because he's the man, and he's going to buy the house on 62nd and Rhodes in Chicago. He was turned down. They would not sell the house to him. He got in the car with his very fair white wife, went around the corner, she went in, she was able to get the house. This is in my family. This is Mother Dear's grandmother. My mother's grandmother.
And of course, there's a lot of cases like that. But you know, I played on a college football team. We had 105 guys. The majority of our team was African American. They're the closest family. It was the best experience I've ever had in my life. And every guy it was like a brotherhood. It really was. Among black, white, Hispanic, Samoan, doesn't matter. But when we had dinner in the cafeteria, everybody kind of went into their own groups. It wasn't really spoken about. It wasn't like anybody had a problem, but it was almost like that was the time where race really became a factor, because I think it was a comfort level. It was like for thousands of years, tribes, religions, they surround themselves with people that look like them, that they're comfortable with. And there used to be an African-American guy that would sit at the white table. And all of the black players started teasing him, and they would call him Cowboy John. That was his nickname by the black players, because they felt like, oh, he sold out. Yes, that he sold out.
When you talk about the different shades of colors, even in the Hispanic culture, you can find a Hispanic who's totally white, but they come from a different part of the island, in Puerto Rico or Spain or Brazil. totally white. You would think they're Anglos walking into Chicago.
Light skin, blue eyes.
Light skin, blue eyes, and then they start talking Spanish. But then they have a different reaction to them because of the language.
Right.
So the different shades, even within the same culture, you have that discrimination. But I think that has to deal with your power of status within your society. So you have people in the island, people here in Chicago and across the country, that despite if you're Hispanic, where are you in the social ladder? If you're up here, then we think, okay, you must be white, even though you're Hispanic, because of your education and so forth. So there is that discrimination that exists within brown and brown and black and black.
What about in the Asian culture, G?
Well, it's very interesting. I think when I think of the Latinos and Hispanics, it's very similar to Asians, Asian Americans in particular, because we come from a very wide geographical range. Indians are Asians. It covers Southeast Asians. It covers the Eastern Asians. We all come in very different shades. And in fact, we're talking about the discrimination within the race. Also, even just in the Asian culture society, we've always likened and wanted to have lighter skin. And in fact, not only just based on skin tone, but also on facial features as well. There's a very rampant desire in Asia to have surgeries, mass amounts of surgeries, to look more Western.
I'm so glad G brought that up, and I'm going to kick it back to you, Tim, because this is the white supremacist institutional worldview. That's a serious problem.
The key.
Whether it's black women wearing straight weave from India, or whether it's black people using Ambi on their skin so they can become a few shades lighter. Where does that come from?
Well, there are African, there are women in sub-Saharan Africa right now who are dying from using chemicals that are killing them. They're toxic chemicals to lighten their skin. They did not do that 400 and 500 years ago in Africa. They did not, Asian women did not have surgery to change the epicanthic fold of the eye 300 and 400 years ago. It is Western beauty standards that are part of white supremacist culture that have told the world, because we market everything. We market Coca-Cola, we market Big Mac, and we market white supremacy. And we're telling the world this is what beauty is. We ought not be surprised when folks internalize some of that and turn it against themselves, but let's always go back to the source. I'm afraid that when we talk about racism or bias within groups of color, we forget that the source is still white supremacy. That's the issue.
Let me just add to that. I think what's happened, I think within the race, within the same color, the same race, there's a word that we're not mentioning here, is resolved. Since I cannot get to that ladder, now I've resolved myself to what people have said I am. I must be a loser, I must not be educated, so then I fight against my own people. Says I can't get to the power. And so this word resolve is happening through all our systems across black, whether it be black or brown.
That's classic W.E.B. Du Bois with the veil. I know who I am, but what do others think about me?
Well, we got to take a short break. As it turns out, there's a racial protest happening right now outside of our studio. We're going to talk about that when we come back. That's a live look right outside of our studio right now, and there's a protest going on based on Jimmy Kimmel and ABC, and so it just coincidentally that we're doing our race show today. Jimmy Kimmel did a bit on his show where he asked a kid about the U.S. owing China so much money, what should we do? And the kid made the joke, we should just kill them all. And then Jimmy Kimmel kind of, laughed a little bit. And then later in the bit, he said, oh, should we let China live or not?
Yeah. He kind of let it go instead of putting it in, and then aired it. So that's why we have more than 50 Asian organizations outside right now protesting ABC, because Jimmy Kimmel, of course, airs on ABC. And, they may feel like that should have never even hit air, number one.
And Jimmy has released his apology. It is, quote, there seems to be a lot of people upset with me, more upset than usual. I thought it was obvious that I didn't agree with the statement, but apparently it wasn't, so I just want to say I'm sorry, I apologize. It was certainly not my intent to upset anybody. But this actually raises a good question. We saw the Chris Rock skit earlier. Comedians seem like they get on stage and they have a hall pass to say whatever they want. It's funny. It's like they're a comedian. They can cross that line. or can they?
Well, you know, there's an old Paul Mooney, who's one of the greatest comics and comedy writers in history. He was Richard Pryor's head writer. Has this great way of explaining it. You know, he says, look, you can talk jokes about race, you can tell race jokes, but you have to leave me with an out. That's his line, right? And what he means as a black man is you cannot take my humanity from me in your joke. When you say, let's kill all the Chinese, there's no out. There's no, I mean, that's it. You're sort of done. When Chris Rock or Dave Chappelle or other comics like Pryor, who have done incredible humor regarding race, do what they do, or you know, people like Louis C.K. now, who does similar jokes about race, white guy, actually Latino, but visually white, they do it in a way that pokes fun at racism, not race. In other words, they're really making racism the butt of the joke, not a group of people. That's a fundamental difference.
It's a very distinction between laughing at someone and laughing with someone.
Right.
And I think, you know, the finer comedians know that it's laughing with someone about racism.
Right, but some people could be highly offended by things that comedians say, and they walk away from the show going, that guy's a racist.
Yeah,
you know?
Intent. I think intent is the final, you know, judge in that particular situation. I mean, you can look at an Andrew Dice Clay, all right? You can say, wow, that's funny. It's a little insulting, but it's funny. And but Andrew Dice Clay always has an out, and that's the difference with this. It's the intent.
But should they get a pass? Because if I came on this show and said, hey, I'm just doing comedy.
Well, you ain't a comedian.
No, but what if I was?
Right.
I mean, I'll discuss this more tomorrow, but in terms of the protest that's going outside right now, and it's because of Asian American racism, and I'll discuss more of that tomorrow on our show, but I will just say that I think some comedians are limited depending upon which race they're talking about. I think it took a very long time to issue an apology because I think it's been deemed that it's okay, really, to make fun of Asian Americans in a different sort of way. That wouldn't have been done with a black, if it was based on a black joke, it wouldn't have been.
Right.
I think this brings up a very good point because the Asian race tends to be, you have to explain it, but why is it that people feel like they can make fun of Asians not as quickly as they can make fun of maybe black folks or brown folks?
Okay, well, basically, Asians are known as the silent minority, and because of the way that we have been mobilized, and because we are parts, you know, we're made up of many different groups, we aren't that vocal, and there are a lot of culturally, we are also very polite and all of those. We suffer from positive stereotypes. And so that's...
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, positive stereotypes. And it's basically resulted in, you know, that we're good at math, that we're very good...
G's not good at math.
I'm not good at math. By the way, I'm an excellent driver as well. But just to let you know that, so because we're the silent minority, we're also the invisible minority. So because of that, we're the butt of jokes. We're the one race that everyone can make fun of, and we're also deemed the perpetual foreigner. You know, I had a very interesting conversation with someone that said that, you know, well, Asian Americans, you don't have problems. You guys assimilate easily. You know, you look white. You are all doing well.
I was going to ask you, is it because
economically everyone's well? There's plenty of Asians in universities, but that's not true.
Well, the poverty rates for Asian Americans, particularly Southeast Asians in this country, are roughly double the white rates in large cities. Overall, they're not, but in large cities, which is where 60% of Asian Americans live in 5 large cities in this country. And the poverty rates in those places are nearly double the white rates. So in fact, Asian Americans are experiencing discrimination, mistreatment, and yet we somehow think that these kinds of jokes at their expense are acceptable.
Well, Katie from Downers Grove is in our audience, and she has something she wants to say. Katie?
Personally, unfortunately, we do have racism in this country. But when we point fingers at each other and say it's only white people who are racist, or it's Asians who are racist, or whatever the case is, it's only dividing us more. It's a two-way street. So unless we can work together and figure out how to make it better, we need that to move on. We need that to work together.
That's a good point. And just as we talked about in the last segment about within races we have racism, and that's like as ignorant as it gets. It's like I've been oppressed, or people have been, you know, mistreating me and having prejudice and racism, and I'm going to do it to my own people. You know what I mean?
One of the things, as we continue to talk about racism, we got to remember that the most important race is the human race. How we treat one another. That's a biblical standpoint, how we care for one another. And we got to continue to address. What's more important that we haven't talked about is the kid, probably 8 years old, who said that comment. Now, that's 50 years from now that we're still dealing with that mindset. Until we educate our people to continue to love one another and be able to celebrate each other's culture. we'll continue to have what we're having here.
All right, more on this special show coming up, including what some of our city's teens think about race. We'll be right back.